Thank you for joining us today for our discussion on ADHD. My name is Dr. Jacques Mostert and I am the Brand Academic Manager for Abbotts Colleges. So what is ADHD? ADHD stands for Attention Deficit and Hyperactivity Disorder, a chronic brain disorder that lasts throughout a person's lifetime. The attention deficit part is about inattention, forgetfulness, not remembering what you were doing at that time. Now, I'm not talking about that time that you walk into the kitchen and you can't remember why you are there. We all have that, and that is definitely not attention deficit. The second part is the hyperactivity part. Now, this is much easier to recognize. It's when your child seems like they are driven by a motor. They're always on the go. And that is also quite a difficult situation to deal with in families when you have a child that's jumping on furniture and running around and just never seems to quiet down. And then there is the combined type. Now, when we look at diagnosing attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, we must be very, very careful. People quite often say, but it seems like suddenly everybody has ADHD. Now, this is just not the truth. The fact is that ADHD covers about 6% of society. It is more prevalent in boys, but girls also can feature traits of ADHD. And we see that this should be behavior that is atypical over a long period of time and is not because of a dysfunctional environment. It is not because of maybe a lack of structure at the home. And there's a third very important thing that might mimic specifically the inattention part of ADHD, and that is called convergence insufficiency. Now, convergence insufficiency is an eye disorder, and what happens is that especially in teenagers, when they read, they actually skip a line, which means that they read line 1, skip line 2, read line 3, skip line 4, but they don't know that they're doing this. And that then presents as inattention and not being able to really understand the text that they are engaged with. But it's not. It is convergence insufficiency, and actually something that a behavioral optometrist can sort out quite quickly with a few eye exercises and glasses. So how do I know that I need to refer my child to a doctor or a psychiatrist to have ADHD diagnosed? There are a few things, and what we're going to do is we're going to first look at the inattention part, and then we're going to look at the hyperactivity part, and then put it together. Now, the inattention part is a little bit more difficult to diagnose or recognize. You might find that your child forgets to do homework, or they forget their books at school, or they forget where they placed something. You might find that they find it difficult to interact with other people. They often find it difficult to organize themselves, and forgetfulness in terms of where they placed things. They may lose things like, again, textbooks. Where did you put the keys? Where did you last have that specific toy? And that contributes then to inattention. Now, when a young person has only the attention deficit part of ADHD, that becomes a little bit of a problem because education suffers greatly because of inattention, and because we might just think that our kid is a little bit absent-minded, we don't realize that it is actually a big part of the disorder. The second part of ADHD, the hyperactivity disorder part, is much easier to recognize. Now, again, we must make sure that this is not because of a dysfunctional environment or environmental problems. We must make very sure that it is not because of energy drinks that they may consume, specifically on a very regular basis, and that it is actually in a variety of environments. In other words, this hyperactivity must take place at home, at school, and in play. So if it only takes place at school, and not at home and not during play, then we have to think about what else could be causing the hyperactivity. If it only takes place in environments where there isn't a very structured environment, specific times where things happen, good, solid, healthy habits taking place, where sleep is not something that is regulated, then we also know that that is the problem and it's not hyperactivity disorder. So we see with young kids, they are always fidgety, maybe tapping their feet or tapping a pen on the table or a pencil on the table. That is quite irritating for the teacher, of course, but it also becomes irritating and disruptive for the other children in the class. They may leave their seat quite often, specifically when they're not supposed to be leaving their seat, maybe in an assessment environment. You may find that they climb all over the furniture at home, and then they're under the table, and then they're on the table, and they might be even jumping on the bed all the time. They are unable to sustain play. And this then causes a lot of other problems, specifically in terms of socialization. Peers might find it very difficult to interact with them because they are in the play, then they're out the play. They always try to direct the play into a different direction where the friends may not want to have it directed. And this quite often makes kids with ADHD quite unpopular, might even lead to some bullying and a very strong sense of isolation taking place. They may talk excessively, as if you cannot stop them talking at all. A little bit earlier, I spoke about the idea that it seems like they are driven by a motor. They are on the go all the time. In class, they might blurt out answers, or they may want to take over the lesson by talking about the things that they are interested in. And of course, they have a lot of trouble waiting their turn, which again has very strong social implications. Now, the impact of ADHD is not only on those in the environment around the child. It's not only disruptive for the teacher in the lesson, but it also contributes to stress in the family. There quite often are relationship strains. A little bit later in life we find this as well, as adolescents start going out with friends, how they are building relationships, and even later on in their romantic relationships. Inevitably, education is the big problem, both for the inattentive type as well as the hyperactivity type, and where the two are combined. We find that young people actually find it very difficult to reach their potential. They're very intelligent, very capable, and very able to do the work. But because this disorder actually does not allow them to spend enough time on doing the work, engaging in the work, even spending enough time and attention to detail, we see that it becomes a barrier to learning. Chronic stress goes along with ADHD. This young person is well aware of the impact that their disorder have on them, and therefore they continue to be stressed about it. And when we see a little bit later, when we talk about medication, the impact that the medication has on them. Sometimes we also find that sense of isolation that I spoke about turns into anxiety and other mood disorders. And there is a third disorder that is now being diagnosed and will be in the next Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, version 6, is something called gaming disorder. We also find that young people that are quite impulsive and have the hyperactivity part of it, they may get into trouble much more than they would if they were being under treatment or being helped in a different way. There's another very interesting aspect of ADHD that parents get confused by, and quite often parents would say to me, but I don't think my child has ADHD because they can spend hours in front of the computer and playing games. Now, the reason for this is the immediate gratification that these games are designed to give. You get immediate feedback through the game that you are playing, and the immediate feedback helps the person then concentrate and be in the game, immersed in it, and we then often become quite confused. But it is because these gaming activities are very short-paced, the activities are very fast, they're on the go, and therefore it doesn't take a lot of attention to remain part of the game. So even though it seems like they are concentrating, the game is designed to mimic that concentration in the way that it is designed. The second part of it is disruptive sleep. What is important to understand is that any device that we use, your computer, your tablet, your phone, with an LED light emits blue light, so the blue part of the light spectrum. And this is very important because it inhibits melatonin. Melatonin is a neurotransmitter that makes us feel sleepy. When you, a little bit later at night, you start falling asleep, that is because melatonin is emitted. But if the child is on his or her phone right into sleep time, going to bed or even a little bit later, what happens is that melatonin is not released. And even though the child sleeps, it is disrupted sleep. So the sleep cycle doesn't continue. And why sleep is so very, very important is that our brains clean itself while we are sleeping. And if we have disrupted sleep and we don't go through the complete sleep cycle, that means the brain did not have enough time to clean itself. Why is this important? Quite often, parents report that their child with ADHD can become very aggressive, quite angry at times, and this is because of the disrupted sleep. If the brain does not have that opportunity to clean itself, it means that the child has less opportunity to regulate their own behavior because the brain is still filled with all of these neurotransmitters that were supposed to be emitted through sleep. And that then leads to aggression, anger, and even mood disorders such as anxiety and depression. So how do we treat ADHD? The first answer, and most probably the most contentious answer, is medication. Now, medication plays a very big role in treating ADHD. And yes, it is true that the medication that is usually prescribed do contain stimulants. And the stimulants help then to focus the child. The problem with some of these medications is that it doesn't have a very long half-life. Now, half-life means how long the medication stays in your system. So we see that quite often a child needs a top-up, maybe by second break or just after school so that they can concentrate for doing their homework. Parents are quite often concerned about giving their child medication because they always think that medication leads to other addictions, and this is just not the truth. The fact of the matter is that because the medication mediates the impulsivity, the chances of the child engaging in high-risk behavior that is based on impulsivity, like other substance abuses, is reduced, especially if the medication is sustained over a long period of time. Another question that parents quite often ask me is, but I don't like it to have my child on his or her medication over holidays and weekends. Now, there is some research showing us that that is not a very good idea because of, once again, the half-life of the medication, that it stays in the system and it helps the brain develop in the normal way. The other problem is that the strain in the family becomes a little bit more pronounced, especially where impulsivity and hyperactivity comes in. Because having a child running around the house all the time and you are trying to just have a nice quiet weekend, then quite often means that there can become a conflict situation between parent and child or the child and their siblings. A very important thing to remember about ADHD and medication is the way that the brain is structured. Now, we know that children with ADHD actually have a much thinner cerebral cortex than children without ADHD. And there's a lot of evidence showing right now that a child that has been on sustained medication over a period of about 4 or 5 years, the cerebral cortex actually develops to become the same neurotypical size as everybody else. And this is then when you can start looking at certain types of behavioral treatments, which means that medication is not necessarily needed anymore. And then, of course, it is very important that you have very good routines. So kids with ADHD are quite often the children that like going to school because school provides a very good structure. They know what to expect. They know exactly what the periods are. They know when break time is, and they know specifically where there is good behavior management in classroom, they know what is expected from them. It doesn't necessarily make it much easier for them, but at least the predictability and the structure of the school helps a child to mediate the symptoms that they have and they show. The problem comes in if that same type of structure is not in the parental household. In other words, the time that dinner is served is not at the same time, family time is not at the same time, going to bedtime is not at the same time, and then allowing the child to have their mobile device with them and they can access and go on to, well, they don't go on to Facebook anymore, do they? But go on to TikTok or WhatsApp their friends and be active all the time. So that then means that this predictability is removed out of the situation. And then, of course, there is nutrition. Now, we know that sugar is not good for us, not only because it's not good for our teeth, but it is also provides that additional energy. So what happens is, through the normal run-of-the-mill day, the child contains all of that energy through the sugar and that tiredness that we expect. The melatonin kicking in, that doesn't kick in because the sugar then is kind of working against either the therapy, the behavioral strategies, or the medication. So, what else can we do that is not medication based? It is very important that both the parents and the child understand what ADHD is, understand that it is not the child's fault, and understand that through behavioral strategies, you can help yourself to form those habits. You can help yourself to remain focused, maybe breaking down your homework time into 10-minute slots, taking a 5-minute break, and then moving on. Another very easy strategy that I give parents is one that might sound a little bit funny. But you know what, Mom and Dad? Go out and buy a trampoline and let your child, make it safe of course, but make your child use that trampoline, specifically just before dinner time. Let them just get some of that energy spent. And as adults, we often like being on a trampoline, so kids inevitably love trampolines. And the way the trampoline works is not only that it's physical exercise, which then means that oxygenation takes place in the brain, and it helps them to become more tired, it helps them to spend some of that energy, but it also helps them regulate their own behavior. Behavioral interventions are very important, and quite often a child with ADHD should be in therapy, not because of anxiety or mood difficulties or some of the other problems they may face, such as feeling isolated or a sense of guilt that they cannot achieve the grades that they want to achieve, but quite often because the therapist can help them with cognitive behavior strategies. And this becomes very important later in life, especially if you choose to not continue with the medication after a specific time. Social interventions works in the same place, helping the child understand that you have to allow other people to speak as well. You have to interact, and there should be reciprocity between friends in conversations, and that to and fro that is important in a conversation can be practiced at home, especially if parents also then go for training. And that is the next thing. Parents, you are not helpless in this situation. Parental training, how to deal with ADHD, not only through webinars like this, but actually talking to a therapist yourself and understanding what your child goes through, help you then to understand them much better and then regulate your own behavior. You may decide that actually a structured household is much more important, even though that's not necessarily part of your own nature. And then finally, it is very, very important to understand that these young people have a very positive future ahead of them, that ADHD does not have to be debilitating, but that it can lead to a successful future and a successful career that will help them achieve their goals and self-actualize. So now is the time that we go to questions. We have quite a few questions, and I've decided to take 4 questions. Now the first one comes from Secunda, and Secunda lives in Cape Town. And Secunda asks, is the medication prescribed to my child going to make him more susceptible to other substances and substance abuse? As I said earlier, and the reason I chose to take this question is that we have to know that this is a falsehood. When parents try to find out more about ADHD, they quite often go to social media, they quite often go onto Facebook, and they try to understand the condition a little bit better. And unfortunately, there is a great deal of misinformation outside. And it is much more important that you actually talk to your doctor, to a clinical psychologist or an educational psychologist to educate yourself about ADHD. I also previously said, because the medication helps mediate the impulsivity, it actually means the chances that your child is going to be dabbling in other forms of substances is reduced. Now, parents, you must understand, this is not always the case. Sometimes the child that is taking medication for ADHD because of the environment they find themselves in may be introduced to other substances. You cannot protect your child 24/7, and this is why it is so very important that sustained conversation with your child becomes important. Don't just allow your child to get home after school, go to their room or go and play games. You need to have these more important conversations, these dinner time conversations, the walking and talking conversations in which you can introduce the topic such as substance abuse, such as high-risk behaviors, so that your child can be informed and educated about how to deal with the situation when it comes. And unfortunately, the reality is children are facing much more high-risk situations. Lorato lives in Pretoria, and she says, what can I do to help my child sleep better? So actually, Lorato, quite often we may think that we want our doctor to prescribe melatonin and then maybe give melatonin after dinner, and then our child will be able to go and sleep. But scientific research has actually proven that the melatonin that is taken in tablet form does not have the same effect on the continued sleep cycles. And even though they might fall asleep, there's still that sense of disruptive sleep. The other thing that is vitally important, you need less screen time. Allowing your child to be gaming just before going to bed is not the best way of keeping them entertained. Yes, gaming is part of our young people's lives. It is a very big part of their social lives, but they must time their gaming that there is actually about 45 minutes to an hour after they have played the game so that the brain can regulate the neurotransmitters in that way. James from Northcliffe says, why are there suddenly so many children being diagnosed with ADHD? Isn't it a bit of a fad? James, actually no. The statistics tell us that 6% of children, no matter the culture, no matter where they are in the world, whether in the developed world, whether they are in the developing world, whether they are affluent or poor, 6% of young people present with ADHD. The reason why it feels as if there is so much more taking place now is because diagnosis is taking place in a much more effective way. Teachers at school are trained to recognize the symptoms of ADHD and then have discussions with parents who can then make informed decisions about having diagnoses taking place. And of course, population growth. So there are more people being diagnosed with ADHD, but percentage-wise, it still remains 6% internationally. So it is not a fad, it is an actual condition, it is a structural part of the brain that, as I said, we don't really understand why it develops in that way. I've spoken about the cerebral cortex, but we do know that it is not being overdiagnosed. And then the last question is from Tabi Singh. Tabi Singh lives in Midrand. We decided to not make use of medication. What can we do to help our son cope with his impulsivity? And Tabi Singh, the first thing that is very important is the structured time at home. Waking up at exactly the same time every day, making sure that breakfast is served at the same time, making sure that there's a very strong structure in terms of family time, making sure that you have dinner served at the right times, and that there is predictability. Your child must be able to predict when things are going to happen. The second thing will be behavioral strategies. So you may choose to not go the medication route, but I do think that it is important to engage with a therapist so that those behavioral strategies can be put in place and that your child can learn when and how to use those behavioral strategies. Remember the trampoline? That's not a bad thing. Exercise, exercise, and exercise. It is very important that your child engages in exercise. What often happens is, especially if you're not using medication, there's much more screen time and not enough green time, which means your child doesn't have enough time playing outside. Now, playing is very, very important because not only does it contribute to imagination, but it also contributes to problem solving, specifically if gaming is not part of that playing. And then finally, building that relationship, talking about it, not just asking how was school today, but asking specific questions about school and specific subjects and specific areas where the child may feel that they are not performing well enough, and then having those discussions. I want to thank you all for being with us today. Please send more questions and we will attempt to answer them in the feed below to make sure that you can have a better understanding of ADHD and a better understanding of how you can help your child coping with ADHD.